What is up, everybody? Welcome back to The Film Jump with Jesse and Chris. We have a very special episode for you today. We're going to be talking about, arguably, if not definitively, the greatest director of the 21st century, Christopher Nolan. Chris, let's get right into it. I don't want to waste any time. We got a lot of, 12 movies to talk about here?
12 films, yep.
Yeah. Christopher Nolan is currently, one of the front runners to win Best Director, I'm sure, at, the Oscars. And he just won the Golden Globe for Best Director. Oppenheimer got the Best Picture Drama. Cillian Murphy got the Actor. RDJ got Supporting. It seems like it's full steam ahead for the award season, and we're super excited. And we're going to give you a lot of reasons why we think Christopher Nolan is probably the greatest director of the 21st century over a lot of other directors. And that's not really counting the old greats like Spielberg's and, Francis Ford Coppola and Scorsese and all of them. This is the 21st century we're talking about. And yes, we do know that his first feature-length film came out in 1998, but he is a director of the 21st century. Chris, let's get right into it.
Yeah, so feature film debut, 1998, following an indie film, a $6,000 budget.
Wow.
One of the most interesting pieces of trivia about that film is that principal photography took place over the course of 1 year. Every cast and crew member had other full-time jobs, so they only shot on Saturdays, and only about 15 minutes of footage each Saturday.
That's independent
until,
for sure.
Until they completed it, yeah, and shot on black and white 16 millimeter footage. They had to be careful with what they shot because he could only afford so much footage.
Yeah.
And made a 69-minute movie. And for, it's certainly one of the most inspiring indie films and film debuts you could ever watch as anyone who has aspirations to be a filmmaker, because he does so much with so little. It's such a interesting and unique film, and we'll get into the plot of it, but it's to come out of the gate with a film like this as your debut is insane.
And it was met with critical praise as well.
Yeah.
That goes without saying. All his films are, and we'll get into that.
Mm-hmm.
So, I don't really recall seeing a whole lot of that, I'm going to be honest, but I don't think a whole lot of people have either.
No, it is part of the Criterion Collection, which
right.
is amazing that it honored his film. And so the basic plot of it is that it's a struggling writer who decides for inspiration he's going to follow around random people in public and try and take inspiration for writing from what he sees them doing, what kind of habits they have, this, that, and the other. But then it sort of becomes something where it's a little bit less about the writing, and it kind of just becomes a little creepy. He sets himself down rules like never follow the same person twice, things like that. But then one of the people that he follows kind of turns the tables on him and asks him why he was following him, and then turns out that guy sort of breaks into people's homes and just to kind of and it's this weird just tumbling effect of twists and turns, and I won't spoil the whole film, but Nolan was inspired with the plot because he had his own house broken into, and he wondered what people thought of him as they were seeing and looking around his house at his belongings. So it's just one of these weird gestating ideas, and it's to be 69 minutes and told not chronologically like Christopher Nolan always does. It's just this really, really compelling narrative.
Yeah, that's a really solid one. All right, well, I think we should move on to his next movie, which tell me about it.
Okay, that was Memento in 2000, and he leans into the non-linear storytelling very much with this one by having the main character of the film be someone with, which is it, anterograde or retrograde amnesia, I forget, but he has no short-term memory. So every few minutes he's forgetting what happened more than a few minutes ago, and the way that Nolan tells that story is by having the scenes of the film be in reverse chronological order. So you're essentially starting at the end of the film, and you're unraveling the mystery, not with a character unraveling the mystery, but as the film's showing you. Every 5 minutes, every scene ends where the last scene began.
Yeah, it's very cool. He did this interesting diagram, and if you look it up, he can, he'll explain it on kind of like a whiteboard where it starts in the beginning and then it cuts to the end and then it cuts to a little bit more forward and chronology, and then when it goes to the other one, and it's different, kind of like in the way that Oppenheimer is. It's color and black and white, and
two parallel storylines almost that kind of meet in the middle.
They kind of meet in the middle chronologically, which is a climax, and it stars the always underrated Guy Pearce. I'm a total Guy Pearce stan. Watch anything he's in, and everything about this movie is just fantastic from top to bottom.
Yeah, it's one of the few films where I watched it the first time on Netflix, and immediately after seeing it the first time, I watched it again because I was just kind of confused and compelled and just kind of blown away with it. And it's just this great puzzle piece. The following Criterion Blu-ray has a great special feature where you can watch the film chronologically edited. And Nolan
that's so cool.
Nolan prepared that edit to kind of make sure that when he was showing it to people that it did all add up and make sense. It wasn't just a lot of trickery. There was a DVD version of Memento that had a bonus feature that essentially did that. None of the modern Blu-rays have a sort of chronological presentation of Memento, but it would be an awesome thing to see, just to kind of let it unravel in your mind. But it's really great. Guy Pearce is awesome in it. And if there are Matrix fans, there are a couple of, Carrie-Anne Moss is in here, as well as the man who played Cypher from The Matrix is also in here. So you get a couple of Matrix alumni in this movie, and it's, an equally mind-blowing experience, just in another way.
Like many of his movies, it definitely rewards the audience upon almost an immediate rewatch, and you can like marinate in what happened as you watch it again. And that's the thing with a lot of his movies going forward is the rewatchability of them all, almost intentionally so.
Yeah, I would say that it's almost meant that, it might be a pretentious thing to say, but his films are almost designed for the second viewing. Maybe they're designed to be able to come back. Like, some movies kind of wow you the first time around, and then under further scrutiny they kind of they have less to offer. His is almost like that second viewing is sort of where the magic happens, because it all kind of comes together. Maybe that's good, maybe that's bad, it's all subjective, but I really do like that.
Yeah, and another thing that I like about Memento is there's this moral ambiguity with the main character and his decisions that he has to make and the consequences, and that, what he chooses to accept versus what he ignores. And you kind of see that a lot in his movies where, some of his main characters, they're not always like making the right decision or whatever, and I think we'll mention it now, is pretty much, I think there might be one or two, but for the most part Christopher Nolan is also the writer of almost all his movies,
or at least co-writer
in the screenplay, and he also sits behind the camera for a lot of them, even though a cinematographer will get credited, I believe. I've seen him where he is behind the camera, especially in those IMAX shots. And
he's big on not doing the video village thing where everyone can look at the dailies and the footage that's coming. He's very big on a traditional old school style of, he pretty much never uses a second unit.
No extra coverage.
No second unit director, no extra unit. Like, he tries to make it all one unit of filming, meaning, that's when productions are so big they break off into the main unit and the second unit, and sometimes the second unit will be shooting like stunt photography or insert shots of doors closing and vehicles and stunt work and things like that the main unit is sort of prioritizing the actors and things like that. Nolan likes to film it all more or less himself, which is important.
Definitely check out Memento, and then after you check it out one more time. All right, so let's go right along though and get into the next one after Memento.
2002 Insomnia, probably his most traditional movie in terms of the way there's no narrative chronology trickery or anything like that. It's just kind of this, it's setting you up like it's going to be this sort of murder mystery, and in a sense it is, but it throws this twist in it with an unexpected murder that happens in the first act. We won't spoil the whole film, but it then ends up becoming this crazy cat and mouse game between a detective and a murderer, and they each sort of have information and knowledge and on each other, and they're trying to sort of navigate this way of how to one up each other throughout this, and the whole time it's set during the daylight period in Alaska.
There's no nighttime.
Where there's no nighttime, so the main character, played by Al Pacino, really good performance, is struggling with insomnia. As the title implies, and so he's not sleeping, so he's having moments where he's even doubting what he's hearing and what he's seeing, and a rare villain performance from Robin Williams. Very sort of cold and calculated kind of role for him, but a really, really solid one.
Yeah, I think when people discuss Nolan's filmography, first of all, Following doesn't really get mentioned, but definitely Insomnia. I don't really think it's mentioned a whole lot among the pantheon of his great movies. And if you ask me, none of them are bad. And in fact, Insomnia is actually quite good.
Yeah, I think Insomnia is solid. And I'm one of those where I would say I would probably rate it lowest for me. Maybe we'll get into rankings or at least groupings of rankings later, but to me it's just sort of, it's probably the most sort of standard issue movie that he delivers. It's kind of a straightforward plot, a straightforward narrative. It's got twists and turns, but it's nothing really, it doesn't have a lot of the hallmarks of what immediately comes to mind when you think of a Christopher Nolan movie, like a wild concept or an adaptation or some crazy practical effects set piece or a narrative trick and chronology trick or anything like that. It's pretty just straightforward. Especially
coming after Memento, and which that one was actually nominated a couple times for some Oscars here and there. But anyways, definitely check out Insomnia.
Yeah, and this was kind of his first kind of like studio film, so to speak, sort of getting entrenched into Hollywood proper. After that, he moved on to a major studio production, which was 2005's Batman Begins, to launch his Dark Knight trilogy, what would become his Dark Knight trilogy, but Batman Begins is where it started, 2005. The last Batman movie was Batman and Robin in 1997. People had declared that franchise dead, that IP dead. The superhero genre was booming again in the wake of Spider-Man 2002 and things of that, and X-Men and things of that nature, but Batman Begins sort of did a very sort of serious, grounded, gritty, when you think grounded, gritty reboot, Batman Begins kind of brought that to the table.
I think it definitely changed the industry when you think about how Spider-Man, and X-Men and some of these early superhero movies that kind of proved that these can be done. Nolan came in with Batman Begins and said, this is how it can be done in a almost grounded, slightly fantasy, but not really, just realistic, grungy, dirty way.
Yeah, stylized, but with a sort of realistic presentation. He showed his crew Blade Runner before filming began to kind of instill the sort of tone and style they were looking for and the spirit that Gotham was trying to have. And one thing that's interesting is that Scarecrow is a villain in that film, and he uses the toxic gas that Scarecrow blasts out. He uses this as an opportunity to catch these really stylized and nightmarish imagery, and probably the most outlandish imagery Nolan's ever put in any of his movies. You're seeing Batman through the eyes of whacked out villains that are seeing him as like a giant bat creature and things like that. So it lets Nolan capture this very comic booky visual aesthetic without really breaking the reality and the tone of the film he's making.
Yeah, again, not to really get into rankings now, but personally, for me, I think I enjoy Batman Begins as a Batman film, kind of more so over The Dark Knight Rises, and we'll get into that in a little bit. I think it's just an excellent origin story. Christian Bale, Liam Neeson, Gary Oldman, everybody in that movie under Nolan's direction. It's just very, very well done, and I remember seeing that with my mom, and it was actually a very, very nice experience to go to the theater with her and see this movie that we weren't really expecting to be as great, because Nolan wasn't a household name at that time. And even with Batman Begins, I don't think he was.
Yeah, and my mom actually took me to it as well. I think it came out a day or two before my 13th birthday, so that was one of my 13th birthday presents, was my mom took me to that movie. And when you're 13, you're kind of thinking like, oh, is this like a prequel to the Batman movies we've seen before? Like, I know it's Batman Begins, so like I think the normies who weren't really in on it weren't really understanding maybe quite exactly what it was, and to see it sort of a superhero origin story never felt like it had been so definitively told, especially for Batman. You get minutes and minutes of trial and error on the equipment and the suit, and so by the time you get to the third act and he's fully formed, you completely buy it and you completely believe it. And it's one of those, I liked it in theaters, but then it was one of those DVDs that just got a lot of replay time from me. I just really rediscovered that movie when we bought it on DVD, and I was like, oh my gosh, I did not like this as much the first time I saw it, but then I just loved it more and more.
And correct me if I'm wrong, who was the composer on Batman Begins?
It was a combination of Hans Zimmer and James Newton Howard.
Right, and then Hans Zimmer would later take on the role of like the main composer.
Yes, yeah. I don't know if they still shared on The Dark Knight or not. I don't know. We'll have to look that up. But the next film on the docket for Christopher Nolan was 2006's The Prestige. I think another really overlooked one because it gets lost in the midst of the Dark Knight trilogy.
Yeah, I agree with that. And in the pantheon of his filmography, The Prestige, I think kind of for a lot of people might get put down towards the bottom. And by no way am I saying that any of his movies are bad at all. It's the opposite. They're all very good. But I know for a lot of people would probably rank The Prestige lower. For me, it's quite high, maybe in the middle of his filmography. Christian Bale, Hugh Jackman, Michael Caine returns.
Rebecca Hall, Scarlett Johansson.
Yeah, it's it's one of those movies where, again, like Memento, you are rewarded upon the rewatch because there's a lot of things held back, and the narrative structure of The Prestige is intentional, and it doesn't feel gimmicky. I think when I was younger and I saw it, I felt like maybe he was intentionally hiding this just so he can do these reveals, but it's so much more than that. There are so many more layers. He treats it almost as if the information is a prestige in and of itself, which is the final part of a magic trick.
Yeah, he's almost treating the film itself kind of playing by the rules of the magic trick that the film lays out, and it's very interesting. The first time I saw it, it was just on a TV broadcast with commercial breaks, and I think like halfway through I was like, I'm stopping because I'm not really getting this the way I want to get it. I said I will rent the DVD. I will find it on a streaming platform to get to watch the film as just a proper film. I'm like, this commercial breaks thing on a regular TV, I'm like, this is not doing it for teenage me. So I was like, I've got to sit down and actually give this a proper watch, and so I did, and I just loved it. I mean, the twists and turns, the performances from Jackman and Christian Bale are just, it's great. It's the sort of dueling protagonist sort of film is an interesting one. It's not that it's a good guy and a bad guy. It's just two men that are sort of ambitious and competitive, and it's just this really interesting duel of their personalities and egos, and it's well handled.
It's definitely I would say, I don't know if I'd use commentary, but it is definitely about obsession.
Yeah.
Both characters are obsessed with beating each other, and also I think it might feature one of the only performances of Andy Serkis with an American accent.
Yeah, and not as a CGI character in a mocap suit, and he's and it shows how great of a character actor he is. That it's like, man, he could have had a whole other career doing like those kind of supporting roles that would just be awesome, and it's also like lightly sci-fi.
It is
in some aspects, and I think initially that might have been what turned some people off. But when you see some of the films that Nolan gets to, where he does this sort of light sci-fi, where there's sort of just these dabbles of sci-fi in the concept, it sort of belongs of a piece with some of his later films that we'll get to.
Yeah, and he has such a grounded way of telling these things through his cinematography and the writing. And David Bowie has a great little role in there as Tesla, Nikola Tesla, and how he's kind of inventing technology and kind of dealing with Thomas Edison on the side. It's very cool. It's almost like an alternate history.
Yeah, it sort of weaves it into history, which is very interesting.
Yeah.
Probably the first time I discovered who the hell Nikola Tesla was. But
definitely one of the more, I don't want to say underlooked, because at this point his filmography is well known, but one of the more underrated films from Nolan for sure. And I think if you were to release it today, or maybe even at like after The Dark Knight Rises with Hugh Jackman and Christian Bale, it probably would have been immensely successful.
Yeah, and I think arguably the last small movie that Nolan ever made, the last one that's mostly propelled by drama and mystery as opposed to anything else. Not that his films are purely spectacle, but there's not really spectacle in this one.
And at this point in his career, he is definitely getting major critical reception or critical praise for his films. Memento was nominated for, I believe, at least 2 Academy Awards. Batman Begins is nominated for Best Cinematography. And The Prestige was also nominated for a couple of Academy Awards, I think, including like costume, stuff like that, and cinematography again. But very, very, very great film.
Yeah, absolutely. Then he kind of moves on to the sort of real big breakthrough for the mainstream, which is The Dark Knight.
The Dark Knight.
The sequel to Batman Begins. All of the regulars from Batman Begins returning. Katie Holmes replaced by Maggie Gyllenhaal, but Heath Ledger giving an all-time performance as the Joker.
Typically, I think it might be like a little jarring, but it's overlooked because of how powerful and how really, really great this film is.
Mm-hmm. And Maggie Holmes has enough of, Gyllenhaal has enough of a resemblance to Katie Holmes that you can kind of buy it. You can kind of believe that it's a transition that you can kind of buy. It doesn't feel completely jarring, and she gives a great performance too, and just so much about the film feels completely consistent with Batman Begins while also being an evolution. He kind of ditches the sort of bronze and reds for more sort of blues and steels and in terms of the color spectrum, and just it's firing on all cylinders. And I think it might be stereotypical to say, but he doesn't do the chronology playing around with this one. It's a straightforward linear story, but it's a complex one. But it's just, for me, this is sort of like the firing on all cylinders. Like, it just kind of checks all of his boxes and does everything so well,
Yeah, and I think this is where he kind of started with what he's now notorious for, is shooting in IMAX.
Yeah, really a trendsetter in that regard.
Yeah, he really leans into it with not the whole film. The aspect ratio changes.
There's a few key sequences. The opening, a few key action sequences.
When you look at this film, it is in the IMDb, it's rated in number 3 or 4, something like that.
Yeah, it's very high up there.
Everybody praises it as one of the best movies of all time, not just a great Nolan film or a great Batman film. And in a weird way, there's not very little Batman, but I think there's more Batman in this than there is in The Dark Knight Rises. But it's less of a Batman movie. It's almost like a crime.
Yeah,
people almost like a Michael Mann type.
People say it's Christopher Nolan's Heat. It's sort of his good, the bad, and the ugly kind of thing, but in a sort of Gotham setting.
If I gotta say, that's kind of doing it a disservice. It's better than those.
I think so. I'd watch it over The Town or Heat or anything like that. It's got those vibes for sure, but I'll take this one over those any day of the week.
And he ditches the almost not fantastical, but the more fictional version of Gotham, and Batman
stylized.
And Batman Begins, his version of the Narrows, the Gotham Narrows. I believe a lot of it, when it shows the wides, is CGI, but it feels grimy. Mm-hmm. It kind of feels closer to the Batman with Robert Pattinson and that look. But he goes for more of a traditional Chicago-style looking city, and it does ground it that much more. Yeah,
you lose a little bit of the aspect of Gotham being a character in and of itself, because it just feels like a city. But it's like the characters are, this film isn't trying to give a lot of personality to the city itself. It's sort of going through the characters. And speaking of the way that this one stands out of the trilogy, one of the funniest theater anecdotes from this movie is that opening night, my brother and my best friend saw this film, and on the way out, one of the guys behind us as we're walking out is talking to his friend, and he goes, "Man, that was so good, they have to make a second one." And I was thinking to myself, I'm like, dudes, that was a second one. Like, do you not know that Batman Begins exists? Like, are you kidding me?
Wow.
I was just like blown away. I'm like, just because it's called The Dark Knight, you think that there wasn't one before it? But I'll never forget that.
Yeah, and also, that was another thing, with the title itself. Very rare for a movie at that time to not have like the number 2, chapter 2, part 2, or kind of sequel in the title.
Yeah, they didn't go. I heard they were really considering Batman Continues, but then they decided against it at the last second.
Yeah, that's good. And there's not a whole lot more to be said that hasn't been said, especially about the legendary Heath Ledger, his performance as the Joker, which is an all-time great. Everything about this movie, the writing, the stakes, the finality with what happens to some of the characters, and Batman's journey throughout this movie. At the end, he becomes the Dark Knight and does what is necessary. Yeah. Everything about this will forever cement it in the history of film as one of the best, and I don't think it could really ever be topped. As far as Batman movies go,
and comic book movies,
it's just it is the peak. And that's not to say that Nolan doesn't give other movies, their best shot at being one of the greats. He certainly does, and we'll get into those. But The Dark Knight in particular,
it's a stars aligning kind of moment.
It really is. The lightning strikes not just once but twice. I feel like with this kind of movie, it's just so good, and you just gush about it when you really think about it. And Nolan as a director, he even let Heath Ledger continue on with the scene. He keeps the camera rolling, he lets him improv a little bit.
Yeah.
Famously for the scene with the hospital when it blows up, he walks out.
And all of these...
He's got the detonator, and he's trying to click it, and it doesn't work.
Yeah.
It's hilarious.
Yeah, because they had to, production-wise, build in a delay in the explosions going off for safety reasons. So Heath Ledger sort of leaned into it and was like, oh, I'll gets flustered at it not going off, and then it starts up again and it startles him. It's just a great way to play the sort of walking away from an explosion scene. The video cam footage that Joker does within the film was all handled and directed by Heath Ledger himself. He just did his own thing with it, from the perspective of the character, and everyone gives a great performance in this movie. The cast is so well rounded. It is one of the best. It is a masterpiece. Back in 2008 when making $1 billion at the worldwide box office was very rare. I believe this was the 4th film ever of all time to break $1 billion at the worldwide box office, which is highly, highly impressive. Just can't heap enough praise on it.
And I believe this was his first movie to win any Academy Awards, one for Heath Ledger's performance, and then back when they had the sound editing and sound mixing split, they're now one, but it got best sound editing.
Nice. Okay. Nice to know that the editing was good enough, but the mixing was somehow not.
It's interesting.
It was a unique set of categories for sure. All right. So he follows up The Dark Knight with Inception in 2010.
I think at this point, when the trailer drops, because I remember clear as day, and the name of his film company or his production company plays, and it comes up, and then we see the trailer. I think at that moment I realized this man is going to be regarded as one of the best filmmakers of all time.
Yeah,
he could have stopped at The Dark Knight, and I think would still be considered one of the greats. But when Inception hit, I was like, man.
Even the trailers were events for Christopher Nolan movies. It
felt like it, and it was no, box office chump either. I think it ended up making like 800+ million,
close to 900, yeah,
which is crazy at that time for something that wasn't an IP.
Yeah, and
totally original.
And for people who may not remember, the famous "bwom" sound effect was popularized by the Inception trailer. It's not really a piece of the score of the movie, but the trailer music was so iconic that the "bwom" became a meme in and of itself.
Hans Zimmer score.
Yeah.
But yeah, this one in particular really kind of cemented, I think, Nolan as this storyteller who doesn't really tell traditional stories.
He's playing by his own rules.
It is so cool to me. He does the dream within a dream within a dream thing, and it stars Leonardo DiCaprio, one of the greatest actors of all time, and superstar power
and
there,
leading an exceptional ensemble. Tom Hardy, Ellen Page, Joseph Gordon-Levitt, Michael Caine a little bit again, Cillian Murphy, Ken Watanabe. Like it's got an exceptional cast, and it's the cinematography continues to just be amazing. Christopher Nolan is huge on shooting on film, on celluloid, 35mm, shooting 65mm when he can, going to IMAX footage when he can. Christopher Nolan's notorious for that, and it makes his films just look beautiful.
Yeah, and this one is so cool. It's about thieves essentially have to do a job and they botch it, and after they get caught, they have to do another job to whatever. Only somebody like Christopher Nolan can come up with an idea of planting ideas into somebody through their dreams and stealing ideas and all this other stuff, then jumping into the many layers.
Yeah,
when you really think about it, it's insane.
It's a Nightmare on Elm Street movie, but done as an action heist movie almost. It's dreams within dreams, and the famous tagline, "Your mind is the scene of the crime."
Right.
That's just one for for the history books.
I will give one little criticism in that, in the end, I think the third act, when Tom Hardy's character is skiing around in the snow, some of the gunplay, the action there, it seems a little, it just doesn't feel whatever, but it's intercut like Nolan always does with his 3-tiered climaxes.
Yeah.
it's overshadowed by everything else that's going on. It's not even. It's a non-issue.
And I think at that point he's navigating 5 different timelines or something with the different levels and layers, and that's his big tribute to On Her Majesty's Secret Service, which is his favorite Bond film. But with the skiing and shooting and all that stuff.
And the one of the famous scenes, as if there aren't a whole lot in that movie, anyways, is when Joseph Gordon-Levitt is running down the hallway, and I remember it being headlines where they created this entire hallway because he's a madman and films as real as he can, with the whole hallway spinning. It's just absolutely awesome.
And Joseph Gordon-Levitt was on wires. Christopher Nolan is a famous proponent of practical over digital. Doesn't like to lean on CGI effects very much. He likes to do as much in camera as possible and enhance it with digital effects when he must. He likes to keep a high standard.
Yeah.
His visual effects were always rendered at higher than average resolutions whenever he was working on film. So he commands a high standard, but he deserves it. He delivers a high standard.
Yeah, and I think hindsight, and we'll kind of really quick touch back on The Dark Knight. I think if The Dark Knight had come out today, it would absolutely eat all the other Best Picture nominations for lunch, and it would definitely get it. But back then, the superhero genre, wasn't, widely accepted as filmmaking.
Yeah, you were in the days of Spider-Man 3 and Fantastic Four 2 and stuff, where some of these superhero movies were still kind of schlocky, and Nolan was kind of making a trilogy that was a little bit above and beyond the others,
Right, but I think, when we get to Inception, it is his first Oscar nomination for Best Picture.
Yeah,
he wasn't nominated for Best Director, which is crazy to me when you really think about it.
How did he not get all the nominations?
Yeah, you take any of his movies, in the past 20 years, and you put him out today, and he's getting those nominations.
What are your masterpieces from 2008 that people remember in the audience? What do you go to when you think of 2008, if you can remember specifically what films came out? Because I know most people, if you say The Dark Knight, they say, oh, that's the winner, that's the best one.
But yeah, so it gets nominated for Best Picture, walks away with 4 Oscars, including Best Visual Effects.
Nice.
So it's the first time that they're really the awards are starting to catch on to his movies here, more so than just tiny little things here and there. Walking away with 4 Oscars is no small feat.
Yeah, absolutely. Then so after Inception, 2012, he returns to conclude his Dark Knight trilogy with The Dark Knight Rises. A very, very difficult task, considering that Heath Ledger passed away, and by all accounts, Joker would have been a major presence in any third film.
For sure.
In any third film that Nolan would have made. So really impressive that he even came back and was able to sort of forge a story that manages to kind of sidestep the presence of the Joker and still tell something that feels like it's bringing the trilogy full circle back to Batman Begins in a really kind of rewarding way. And this is one that, when it first came out, I was a little split on it, maybe, good and bad, and it's not a flawless film, but I think more and more, especially as a trilogy, this trilogy, it holds up to rewatches, and this is a really sort of satisfying conclusion to it.
Yeah, it really is better than I think I remember thinking it was. Upon many rewatches, my ranking goes up. It's still my third favorite. I don't even want to say least favorite, because that kind of indicates like, oh, it's not even like, whatever.
It's tough.
I think I barely put it under, if not even with Batman Begins.
Yeah, I think it has higher highs than Batman Begins, but I also think that when some of it gets a little clunky, it's got lower lows than Batman Begins.
Yeah.
There's a few editing moments. Nolan's kind of famous for not really going back and doing reshoots and pickups and things of that nature, and I think he's someone that he just kind of gets inventive in the editing room and cuts around stuff that he feels he doesn't have, and you can kind of see that in some parts of this movie where it's like they kind of do editing to make up for things that maybe the other directors would have gone back and filmed a different scene or a new sequence to kind of plug in. But generally speaking, it still really delivers. Tom Hardy as Bane is so intimidating and such a physical presence,
That put him on the map, his voice. You can't find somebody who is like not a fan that wasn't going around saying, Gotham, doing the whole hand over the mouth.
Exactly. I was wondering which would break first, your spirit or your body. Just great lines,
Real quick though, that fight scene between Bane and Batman, and
brutal.
Under there, the music cuts out. It is so well directed.
Yeah.
It is just great.
The sound design is exceptional. it's very, Batman, people pointed out that Batman goes on a bit of a Rocky 3 arc where Bane is basically Clubber Lang, and so he goes into the first fight overconfident, gets absolutely wrecked, then he has to train and build up to the rematch at the end. Like, it's like Rocky 3 is considered a good third chapter, and so, Nolan's a student of the game, and he's looking at other films to kind of emulate. And Dark Knight Rises, it brings it home in a really kind of satisfying way. Has, it changes up the scenery with snow. It raises the stakes with a nuclear bomb that threatens all of Gotham. Some people can say, hey, that's too big and wild for Batman, but it's kind of, it's the epic conclusion, so to speak. And Anne Hathaway gives a great performance as Catwoman. I think it's a really, it's one of those where it's not necessarily a perfect movie, but it's sort of so dismissed as like, oh, the third one sucked. It's like, that third one does not suck in the way that a lot of third chapters suck. It's like, right. It's a little imperfect, but it's a very, very satisfying conclusion.
Yeah, many people would say that the Batman or the Dark Knight trilogy is the greatest superhero trilogy of all time.
I think so. I would stand by that.
Whether one of them carries the other one, and it doesn't matter. It's so solid. Excellent trilogy.
Agreed.
So if you haven't seen it, check it out.
Yeah, the Dark Knight trilogy is fantastic. After that, 2014, Christopher Nolan delivers Interstellar.
Okay, so I have to say, without Heath Ledger, The Dark Knight Rises was never going to be as good. Nobody expected it to be. But then, a quick shout out to Glenn Powell, who is, and who is currently kind of starting to scratch the surface as his leading man roles now. But Glenn Powell, if you go back and watch The Dark Knight Rises, is a guy that Bane tosses around on Wall Street when he walks in, and they shoot up the place.
There's a great exchange where Glenn Powell's character says, this is a stock exchange. There's no money you can steal. And Ben goes, really? Then why are you people here? Yeah. And it's just a great exchange of dialogue. And he went on to be, he is Hangman in Top Gun Maverick. He's in a current rom-com out called Anyone But You. So he's kind of become a leading man of his own. Yeah,
and he's in the Hitman Linklater film, and he's been with Linklater for a couple movies. But anyways, back on topic here.
Yeah.
I remember very distinctly watching the trailer for Interstellar, and
you sent it to me.
And
you told me it was inspirational.
Yeah.
And I was like, what?
And Matt McConaughey was fresh off his Oscar win for the Dallas Buyers Club in the previous year.
And coming off of True Detective.
Yeah, which I have to say, go back and watch Matt McConaughey's Oscar speech. I think it's one of the greatest ones ever given by a male performer.
Yeah.
Anyways, so I remember when the trailer dropped for this thinking, I think here we finally have what could potentially be a magnum opus, which is crazy to think about.
It felt revolutionary. It was like, this is world changing, like maybe you're young and you're idealistic and you're on the hype train, and then you see a very sort of ambitious teaser that's sort of not really about the movie. It's sort of about the idea of the movie.
We were never meant to stay here. The whole campaign.
Reach for the stars, and it was just like, oh wow, this is going to be something amazing.
Yeah, and 2014 gave us some great films for sure, like John Wick, Godzilla, and many other ones, but Interstellar came out in 2014. Some people are a little mixed, and when it came out, I didn't have the greatest theater experience. And we talk about, you and I, how we kind of rate movies based on our experience, not so much the objective, rating system or whatever. It's all subjective. But, a little bit of personal things here with me. My father at the time wasn't in good health, and he has since passed away. And I remember his health was kind of affecting him in the theater, and I kept glancing at him, worried about him, because it's not a short movie.
No, nearly 3 hours.
It's 240 something, right?
I think it's 249.
Yeah. So, and that kind of took me out of it. So I kind of was not robbed, by no means robbed, but I kind of missed that magic. But surely it came back after I rewatched it, and it's one of his most emotional movies.
Yeah, definitely. At one point it was going to be a Steven Spielberg project, and you can see some of that sentimentality that Spielberg brings to the table in all of his projects. You can see some of that in this film. Very, very emotional sort of father-daughter, father-son story at its core. And Nolan, up to this point, had been kind of criticized for his film being a little cold, a little sort of steely and procedural, and not very, deep on the emotional side and the character depth of things, and more about the concepts. But this one, he was really going in on on that more emotionally rich side of things. And I think, flaws aside, not a perfect movie. The criticisms are there, and no movie's flawless objectively, but it's like that again. It's like the highs that a film reaches versus what are the lows that really bring it down. And there are just sequences and the experience of this movie. If you get to the third act of this movie where things are just going absolutely wild, you are just enthralled. I remember being in the IMAX theater during what we'll just refer to as the docking sequence, and it's just absolutely like you're gripping the armchairs of the seat, and it's just overwhelming. It's amazing.
And he's doing his notorious like 3-tier climax where it all crescendos at the same time. People in space and on Earth and everything else that's going on. It's interesting because that movie only walked away with best visual effects, which was actually quite impressive in a year filled with movies with great visual effects. But I remember that one of the big things was the black hole, how they actually referred to
Kip Thorne, his work, and we're trying to, it's not a 100% bulletproof, scientifically accurate kind of
theory.
movie. It's still sci-fi. It's still sort of space fantasy adventure, but it is sort of presented in a way that feels real. James Cameron's great quote was that the more outlandish a concept is, the more realistic the presentation needs to be, and that's what it's about. It's not saying that, this is how it would be really. This is just as realistic of a presentation of this outlandish concept that we can provide.
Yeah, and as a father, it's probably his most emotional movie that for me personally, and I challenge any kind of father, especially if you have a daughter out there, by the time not to get into spoilers if you haven't for whatever reason seen Interstellar, but in the ending sequence when he goes to the station, we'll just say that, and people who've seen it know what I'm talking about. I challenge any father, especially with a daughter, to just not choke up at that scene. It is powerful, and that's what Nolan is so good at delivering, is these emotional stakes and the finality. Characters go through change and things happen to them, and it's not like your typical, not to bring Marvel into this or the MCU too much, but those movies don't feel like they have a finality so much. Things happen to characters and then they get fixed or they're brought back.
There's a status quo being maintained.
Yeah.
Nolan's making standalone films, and it was a pretentious thing to say, but I remember someone on the internet being like, well, Nolan's not making a franchise, Nolan's making a legacy, and that's built by one great film at a time. And then now we're sitting looking at a dozen of his movies and looking at his resume, and it's incredible.
And I think the score from Hans Zimmer probably
exceptional.
I think looking at it now, it's probably from all of Nolan's filmography, it's the most famous, the most popular, the most used in social media for everything.
And certain scenes and sequences from this movie are memed to death and that's just a tribute to how iconic they are.
Yeah, I think it should have grabbed the Oscar, but that's neither here nor there.
Yep. After 2014, Christopher Nolan moved on to 2017's Dunkirk, a World War II film about the Dunkirk rescue performed by civilian boating vessels during World War II. And, a very different kind of film for Nolan because it's nonfiction. It's based on a historical event. There's not a whole lot of unique and wild things you can do about that. He really prioritizes the IMAX filming and the large format filming. He prioritizes the practical effects, photography, and special effects. But he does do interesting things with the narrative editing wise to differentiate it and still make it a unique movie, which is that it's essentially got three pieces of this film. There's a story on a beach, there's a story on the boats, and there's a story in the air with the biplanes, or not biplanes necessarily, but the planes, fighter planes. And he tells those all on different chronological timelines. They're intercut throughout the movie, but the beach is taking place over the course of a week, and the boat is taking place over the course of a day, and the plane storyline is taking place over the course of, I think, a few hours or 1 hour.
Or something like that.
But it's intercut as if they're all happening simultaneously. There's good and bad things about that, but generally speaking, it creates some great moments. It creates some disorienting moments, but Dunkirk's a solid film.
And it's light on dialogue, which is very cool. A lot of visual storytelling. Mm-hmm. It has what Quentin Tarantino is actually kind of popular. His little interview is popular in that he said he believes that, correct me if I'm wrong, that the shot on the beach when the bombs are impacting and they're approaching the camera
Yeah.
with our main actor right in the front, he said it's like one of the greatest shots in cinema or any war film.
Yeah, it's exceptional visual storytelling, and it's also one of Christopher Nolan's shortest films ever at just a little over 100 minutes. It's a very, people were throwing around terms like experiential cinema. It was about just like having the experience of these war scenes and these war scenarios as it was happening. It's not a very narratively complex movie. And it is interesting in that way that the sound design, especially if there's any Christopher Nolan movie where the sound design feels like it just is light years above others, this one is one
Funny you
of
say
them.
that, because this one won 3 Academy Awards for editing, sound editing, and sound mixing.
There you go.
And this one's a good one because this one was critically praised, I think, even more so than The Dark Knight, in that, objectively speaking here, this was his first picture where he was nominated for Best Director.
Yeah, and deserved. There's a running joke that World War II movies are the way you finally win your Oscar, and it almost got Nolan his Oscar this time, but just an aesthetically really impressive movie. I remember when I put in the 4K disc of this movie, it was shocking how high quality some of the IMAX footage looked on this one. Like it was one that really caught me off guard. All of Nolan's films look great on 4K disc, by the way. Buy them all. They're exceptional.
Yeah, and just a little tidbit. If you watch any of his films digitally, they do not have the expanding IMAX ratios, so you got to get those on Blu-ray or
if you
or
want
Ultra HD.
If you want the black bars to go away and for it to fill up your full screen, get the 4K discs, and you'll see the full image.
Also, Cillian's back in Dunkirk.
Yeah, Cillian Murphy again in a great supporting role. He's in half of Christopher Nolan's films.
Along with Michael Caine, was in like 6 in a row or 7 in a row.
I think 8 altogether. I think he's got a dialogue cameo in Dunkirk. So there you go. All right. So after Dunkirk, it was Tenet.
Tenet.
The film ruined by the lockdowns. It would have been a big theatrical event. It became the sort of first movie trying to be the first movie back out of the lockdowns for theaters, and it was just way too soon. Theaters were not really ready to come back. It was not released nearly widely enough, and audiences were skittish about going back to the theaters. I did see this movie in theaters, and it's special for me because, unfortunately the last movie I saw in theaters before lockdown was Onward from Pixar. I saw that on a date, and I was like, when things were looking rough during the lockdowns, I was like, that can't be the last movie I ever saw in a theater. I was like, please, Lord Jesus, bring theaters back so that I can see something better other than that. And so I got to see Tenet, and it was a very big moment for me, and very complex film. Essentially another sort of a bit of a heist complex movie with the main sci-fi concept at the core being not time travel, but inversion, where things can be reversed through this process, and then they're moving backwards through time instead of forwards through time. A very heady, brainy
It's
concept.
his most complex film, for sure. More than The Prestige, more than Memento.
Yeah.
People... Yeah, I think it's very misunderstood, honestly.
Yeah. Underpraised.
Great performance from John David Washington. And
exactly.
And Robert Pattinson.
Yeah.
Awesome. And again, as one of the Nolan staples, a lot of it is in camera. He crashed a full-size plane into a building. Some of the fight scenes where one character is going forward
through time,
and he's fighting in camera, no VFX, somebody who's going backwards
through time. And the choreography of that,
insane.
And you revisit certain scenes and sequences in the movie through forwards and backwards sort of movement, time travel, or time movement rather, and it's just, again, insanely complex, insanely ambitious, but that's kind of the world that Nolan plays in. Sure, it's got the detriments of that. It gets kind of wrapped up on certain threads of the plot, maybe a little too much, and it has maybe some exposition dumps that maybe aren't as smooth as they could be, but the overall experience, there's a great line in the movie where a character says, don't try to understand it, just try to feel it, and it's like, that's kind of, that's a little bit what you have to roll into the movie with. And again, it's underrated, and these things are designed for that second viewing. You give it a second watch and it all just kind of clicks and sings a little bit better.
And that for me, it felt a little gimmicky, the whole concept, but again, like all his movies, upon rewatch, it only gets better.
And here's the thing, and like Inception, he's not building these for a franchise. He's squeezing the lemon in one movie. So if he introduces this notion of reversing, of traveling backwards through time, he's gonna squeeze that lemon, and he goes balls to the wall on that concept in this film.
The temporal pincer movement, the climax when there's
the fact that you even remember it's a temporal pincer that you've got essentially a mission with one squad moving forward through time through the battle, one squad moving backwards through time through the battle. It's insane.
And they both affect each other.
Yeah, it's some of the most wild stuff you're going to see. And you see things, you're like, well, how does that make sense? That doesn't make sense. But again, you kind of just roll with it. It's like, it doesn't, but it's wild and complex and crazy.
And a really, really cool score by Ludwig Göransson.
Yeah.
Not using Hans Zimmer for this one. Very, very cool.
Killed it. And a great tie-in song by the game.
Yeah. Yeah. So
or called the game, is it? Whatever. Either way. The plan. It's called the plan. Whatever. I don't know.
So, all right.
Well, So, but that was unfortunately a bit of a box office flop because there was no real box office to support the film. So it carries this extra stink around it because it's like, oh, no one saw this movie, but it's great. And then
tell everybody what happened with Nolan as far as who he was with and then who he moved to after that.
So Nolan was playing hardball and was insistent on this film not going to streaming, not this and that, but getting a theatrical release. And he basically strong-armed Warner Brothers into committing to a theater release. I think Nolan was coming from a perspective of theaters can't come back until they have a great product to come back with. You can't just ask theaters everywhere to reopen. What are they going to show? You have to give them something to show. But then the studios were saying, well, we're not putting a movie out until there's a theater base to sustain our movie. And it was this weird game of cat and mouse and chicken. Nolan kind of stuck his flag in the sand and maybe, for all we know, helped save the industry because he committed to Tenet being a theatrical release. They released it in theaters. For theaters that were performing nothing to have this movie, it was a great thing, but it didn't have the infrastructure to be huge at the time. So it was famously sort of a box office loss. It sort of, soured Warner Brothers on theatrical showings. So the entire next year of 2021, Warner Brothers said, okay, everything that we're dropping in theaters, it's hitting streaming day and date on the same time on HBO Max. It's hitting theaters and streaming on HBO Max at the same time. Christopher Nolan, to say that he took umbrage with that is an understatement. He packaged up his next movie and decided that he was going to shop it around. He wasn't going to stay at Warner Brothers where he had made the vast majority of all of his films.
Because at this point, he's proven his worth.
Yes.
He knows we can deliver. And people, sorry to interrupt, but when you look at his filmography all the way up till Tenet being the exception with, I think, maybe Insomnia and following.
And Prestige, yeah.
I think all of his movies are in IMDb top 50.
Oh, that's what you were getting at. I thought you were talking about the distribution.
No.
Wandered.
But his movies, as rated by audience, this isn't by critics or anybody else. It's not a Metacritic. This is by audience, people. And IMDb is still legit. It's not like
there's so many voting on there.
bombed.
It's not like it's all controlled by bots or anything like that. There's value in those ratings.
All of his movies are in the top 50. Almost all, I should say.
Yeah, and so he shopped around his next project, and he had a few demands, which was a 100-day exclusive theatrical window. He wanted a $100 million budget and an equal marketing budget. He wanted the studio that was distributing it to not release another film for 3 weeks before, or 2 or 3 weeks before, and 2 or 3 weeks after his movie to make sure that his movie would be prioritized. And the studio that ended up meeting all of those demands for his film, which ended up being Oppenheimer, was Universal Studios. They said, we want to be in the Christopher Nolan business, and we will check all these boxes for what you want. We'll give you the budget, we'll give you the control, we'll give you the exclusive theatrical window with no streaming competition. We'll keep all of our other films outside of 3 weeks away from you on the schedule. And so that's how Oppenheimer ended up being a Universal Studios movie. And it was released in summer of 2023. And it is about J. Robert Oppenheimer and the development of the nuclear bomb. And
the father of the atomic bomb, as they say.
It's an exceptional film.
The guy who says famously, I am become death, the destroyer of worlds, and continues that whole saying. Well, maybe not famously, because he got that from
the Bhagavad Gita, or I can't pronounce it right, but it's an Indian
Krishna or whatever.
Yeah.
But anyway, so 3-hour R-rated drama ends up making $950 million worldwide.
He asked the studio, whichever studio, to bet big on him. They bet as big as you could bet. R-rated movie, 3 hours, like you say. All these things that would typically be a deterrent for a big summer movie. You can't make it R-rated. You can't make it 3 hours. You can't make it just be a drama with no action sequences. You can't make it just be performance-driven and dialogue-driven. And he did all of that. And it made, essentially the better part of $1 billion, less than 50 million shy of it, and was an exceptional hit. And the critical praise is equal to that. You know, everyone loved it, and it's considered iconic and a masterpiece overnight.
Yeah, many are saying it's his best film. Whether you want to debate that between that or The Dark Knight or whatever, it's subjective. But
yeah,
people are saying it's his best, and here and now, I think this is his year. I sincerely believe, especially after his Golden Globe win, and we'll see what the Screen Actors Guild Award, how that goes. But I sincerely believe this is Nolan's year.
This year more than ever, if he doesn't get it, it will be considered a robbery. I know that. Like, he's had years where he didn't get it before, and people are like, oh my gosh, he was robbed. But this year, if he does not win Best Director, it will be an official robbery in as many ways that you can consider it a robbery.
Oppenheimer should get Best Picture as well.
Yes.
I'm hoping RDJ will get it. Cillian Murphy will get it. I hope they get it for their acting. Mm-hmm. I don't believe that Emily Blunt will necessarily walk away with it. Apparently there's some stronger performance, but we'll see. You never know.
Emily Blunt has a fairly small role,
but she
delivers. This isn't a film designed for a Best Actress nomination.
But she delivers nonetheless.
She absolutely does.
That's another thing. Every single person in this movie delivers. And it is one of the strongest ensemble films I've ever seen.
And every member of this ensemble has been and could be a lead in their own movie. 100%. Sure. You have people like Casey Affleck, who's in 2 scenes, and he's memorable in a 3-hour film. And Josh Hartnett, who hasn't done really much of anything in a long while, and he's great in this film.
Rami Malek gives like a quick 5-minute
and then he has a monologue at the end, and you're like, oh my gosh, where's his nomination? You know, exactly. It's exceptional. It's just...
Gary Oldman steals the show for 2 seconds, and it's incredible.
Yeah, exactly. It's just... everything is firing on all cylinders. Again, it's just one of those stars align, and I don't think the stars have aligned as perfectly since the Dark Knight. In terms of, it just feels like it's got the hype and it delivers and people recognize it. It's like it's got to be right film, right place, right time, and it all lines up. And it happened for The Dark Knight a bit, and it happened here too.
And hopefully he also gets one for the adapted screenplay, because he wrote it in first person.
Yeah, which is a very unusual way to write a screenplay.
So the character would say, I then walk over here, I talk to whatever, rather than this character did that.
Yeah, and screenplays are usually written in the very sort of objective, disconnected sort of way, because you're just describing what's happening. You're not putting, like a novel where you're putting subjectivity into it. So to write a screenplay from first person is like, that's an experiment in and of itself. So Christopher Nolan should absolutely win for Best Adapted Screenplay.
Yeah, I think Oppenheimer 100% cements Christopher Nolan as the greatest director of the 21st century. You could maybe make an argument for people like Denis Villeneuve who are coming out, but they have half of his films. Mm-hmm. And you look at how consistent every 2 to 3 years Christopher Nolan drops a banger of a movie that is not only a technical achievement. He pushes the industry kind of, maybe not as much as like a Cameron, but in his own way he does. Yeah. Audiences love it. Critics love them.
Yeah. People have talked about how it feels like his film, like he's mainstreaming the art house kind of film. Like he doesn't condescend or pander down to audiences or dumb anything down for his audiences, and he's rewarded for it. His films perform huge and are highly regarded because they don't stoop to a lower level. Not that there's anything wrong with 4-quadrant mass appeal movies that indulge in being simple. I love a good, easy, simple, straightforward movie every now and again. That's great, but Nolan doesn't play by that game. Nolan makes a different kind of complex.
It's like highbrow mainstream. It's very interesting. They're not like French New Wave art house cinema. Yeah, but they're not just regular typical movie. I mean, people complain about his movies being very hard to follow sometimes, and maybe they are upon the first watch, but. Yeah. You get so rewarded for watching his films.
I sometimes use my dad kind of jokingly and lovingly as kind of the barometer for what me and my brother think of as a normie viewer. Yeah. And Christopher Nolan makes those kind of movies where it's like they're highbrow and complex and amazing, but our dad still will watch a Christopher Nolan movie and love it and be like, oh my God, this is great, And some people might say, oh, he makes movies that make normies feel like they're watching smart movies. I think that's just people being kind of overly critical and nonsense and pretentious in and of themselves, I think his films are exceptional.
Yeah, we'll see what happens. I think it's going to walk away with gold. Definitely, in the grand scheme of film and the history of film, he is among the best, if not the best, modern filmmakers of all time, and his work speaks for itself. He is a solid dude we could honestly talk about the trivia all day long, but we'd be here for far too long.
Yeah. I can't name a director who I own every film they've directed like I do with Christopher Nolan.
And that you want to, not just that you're trying to complete the collection.
Exactly. There's none that I have to grit my teeth and accept. And even some films he's produced, like Man of Steel, is an exceptional movie.
Yeah.
And he's a producer on that. You know, we don't got to talk about Transcendence. That was rough. But, you know.
Well, here's the thing. With Oppenheimer kind of still in the spotlight in award season, the one thing I'm thinking of more than anything, to be honest with you, because everybody's going to love Oppenheimer forever, whether it wins or not, what is his next movie going to be? Yeah. I cannot wait for that next minute-long teaser that doesn't really give us a whole lot.
Absolutely. And for me personally, I kind of hope, it seems like he's kind of in this pattern now where he'll do something like Dunkirk, and then he'll do a crazy fictional movie, and then he goes and he does something like Oppenheimer. So I kind of do hope. He said the only thing he's really indicated is that he wants to do something a little more light because Oppenheimer was dark. Yeah. So I hope it can be something a little lighter, but maybe he'll go to a fictional concept. And like an original story concept from Christopher Nolan is always something you are just like sitting on the edge of your seat for, because like, what wild thing is he going to come up with, you know?
Yeah. Alrighty, well, that's going to pretty much do it for our discussion on the filmography of the great Christopher Nolan. Let us know what you think about in the comments below. Is he your favorite director? Let us know who your favorite director is.
Yeah, give us your ranking of Christopher Nolan movies. Tell us your favorites. Tell us if there's any you haven't seen. Tell us ones that you've maybe liked or disliked initially and your opinions change, you know? Give us those reevaluations. That's one of the most important things for me with movies, is to give it a second chance and see what your opinion changes on it.
Yeah, because they surely do change upon the rewatch of his movies for sure. So, all right, everyone. Well, thanks for stopping by, and we'll see you next time.